What if the life you committed to forever quietly stopped choosing you back? And the moment you finally realize it, everything changes. This is the untold emotional breakdown of a relationship that looked strong on the outside, but was falling apart behind the scenes. Stay with me till the end, because what happens next will completely change how you see love and commitment. And if you want more real stories like this that hit deep and keep you hooked, make sure you subscribe right now, because you do not want to miss what is coming next. I chose this life when I was still trying to understand what forever really meant. And in those early days, everything felt certain. Everything felt like it was guided by purpose and belief and loyalty. And I told myself over and over that this was not just a phase or a temporary path, but something permanent, something unshakable, something that would define my entire future. And even when the reality started to feel heavier than the dream, I held on to that idea, because walking away was never something I allowed myself to consider. It was never part of the story I imagined for myself. And so when things became difficult, I did not question the structure, I questioned myself. I told myself that this is what commitment looks like, this is what dedication feels like, this is what sacrifice demands. And I learned to sit with sadness without naming it. I learned to smile through moments that felt hollow. I learned to convince myself that feeling overlooked or unseen was just part of the experience. And I kept going, because stopping would mean admitting that something was wrong. And admitting that something was wrong would mean facing a truth I was not ready to see. And so I tried harder. I adjusted more. I gave more of myself, thinking that eventually it would balance out, that eventually things would feel the way they were supposed to feel. But instead, there was a quiet shift that happened over time, something subtle but powerful, something that could not be ignored, no matter how much I tried to bury it. And that shift was the growing realization that I was losing pieces of myself in the process. And the more I tried to hold everything together, the more I felt like I was coming apart inside. And yet, I stayed, because staying felt safer than the unknown. Staying felt like the only option that made sense, even when it stopped making me happy. And I kept telling myself that happiness was not the goal, that stability was the goal, that commitment was the goal, that keeping everything intact was more important than how I felt. And for a long time, that belief carried me through, but it also kept me stuck in a place where I was no longer growing, no longer thriving, only enduring. And as the years passed, the distance between what I believed and what I felt became impossible to ignore. And I started to see that what I once called strength might actually have been fear. Fear of change, fear of judgment, fear of stepping into a life that I had never planned for. And that fear kept me holding on to something that was slowly slipping away, even when it was clear that both of us were no longer in the same place, emotionally, mentally, or even spiritually. And the hardest part was realizing that this was not something that happened suddenly. It was something that unfolded over time, through missed conversations, through unresolved tension, through expectations that were never fully met, and emotions that were never fully expressed. And by the time we reached the point where everything felt distant and strained, the foundation had already weakened to the point where rebuilding it would require more than either of us seemed willing to give. And that is when the silence became louder than anything we could say, because in that silence, there was an understanding that something fundamental had changed, something that could not be undone no matter how much we wished it could be. And yet, even in that moment, I found myself hesitating, because leaving meant stepping into uncertainty. Leaving meant rewriting everything I thought I knew about my life, about my role, about my future. And that was not something I could easily accept. But the truth was becoming clearer with every passing day, that staying was no longer the solution. Staying was no longer the answer to the problems we were facing. It was simply delaying the inevitable. And as that realization settled in, it brought with it a mixture of emotions that were difficult to process. Regret for the years spent trying to fix something that may not have been fixable, sadness for the loss of what once felt so certain, and a quiet sense of relief that maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward. One that did not require me to keep sacrificing parts of myself just to maintain an image of stability. And as I stood in that space between what was and what could be, I realized that the hardest decisions are often the ones that lead to the most necessary changes, and that sometimes the path we choose early in life is not the path we are meant to stay on forever. And that realization was both unsettling and freeing at the same time, because it meant that I had a choice, even if that choice was difficult, even if that choice meant facing consequences I was not fully prepared for. And as I began to accept that possibility, I started to see things differently. I started to understand that love is not just about staying, it is about growing, it is about evolving. It is about being in a space where both people feel valued, supported, and seen. And when that is no longer present, no amount of effort can truly replace it. And that is when the question shifted from how do I make this work to what am I willing to continue sacrificing to keep this going? And the answer to that question was not easy, but it was necessary because it forced me to confront the reality that I had been avoiding for so long. And that reality was that I deserved more than just endurance. I deserved fulfillment. I deserved peace. I deserved a life that felt authentic to who I had become rather than who I once thought I needed to be. And as that understanding took root, it became impossible to ignore. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you acknowledge a truth, you cannot pretend it does not exist. And so I found myself standing at a crossroads between the life I had built and the life I was beginning to imagine. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that choosing myself was not selfish, it was necessary. And that realization marked the beginning of a shift that would change everything. Even though I did not yet know exactly how it would unfold or what the future would look like, I knew that I could not continue as I had before, because something inside me had already changed, and there was no going back to the person I used to be. As the weight of that realization settled deeper into my mind, I started to notice things I had ignored for years. Small moments that once felt insignificant now carried meaning. Conversations that ended too quickly, silences that stretched too long. The way effort slowly became one-sided, and how I kept filling in the gaps, trying to maintain something that required more than just one person holding it together. And it became impossible to deny that what we had was no longer balanced. It was no longer mutual. And yet, admitting that out loud felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. Because once you say it, once you acknowledge that something is broken beyond what you can repair, you cannot go back to pretending everything is fine. And that fear kept me quiet for a long time. It kept me in a place where I continued to act as if things could still change if I just tried a little harder, if I just waited a little longer. But waiting started to feel like standing still while everything around me was moving forward, and that stillness became suffocating. It became a reminder that I was stuck in a version of life that no longer reflected who I was becoming. And the more I tried to hold on to what used to be, the more I felt the distance between us grow wider and colder. And eventually, that distance was no longer just emotional. It became something that affected every part of our lives. The way we communicated, the way we connected, the way we showed up for each other. And it reached a point where even the smallest interactions carried tension, because beneath every word, there was something unspoken, something unresolved, something that neither of us seemed willing or able to fully confront. And it was in one of those moments that everything shifted in a way that could not be undone. The words came out softer than expected, but they carried a weight that changed everything. I just want to be free. And for a second, it felt like time stopped. Because those words were not just about leaving, they were about everything that had led up to that moment. Every unspoken feeling, every unmet need, every silent compromise. And hearing them forced me to face a reality I had been avoiding, that this was no longer about fixing something. This was about accepting that it had already reached its breaking point. And the reaction that followed was not just about anger, it was about loss. It was about the realization that something I believed would last forever was now slipping away in a way I could not control. And in that moment, there was a mixture of emotions that were difficult to process: frustration, confusion, sadness, and a deep sense of disbelief. Because part of me still held on to the idea that we could find a way back, that we could somehow rebuild what had been lost. But another part of me understood that we had been drifting apart for much longer than either of us wanted to admit, and that this moment was not the beginning of the end. It was simply the moment we finally acknowledged it out loud. And as the conversation continued, there was an attempt to soften the impact, to find some form of understanding, to hold on to whatever connection still remained. But even in those efforts, there was an underlying truth that cannot be ignored: that sometimes love is not enough to keep something together when the foundation has already weakened to the point where it can no longer support what is built on top of it. And that realization was one of the hardest to accept, because it challenged everything I believed about commitment, about perseverance, about what it means to stay and work through difficulties. And yet here we were, facing a situation where staying no longer felt like the right choice. And even as apologies were spoken and there was an attempt to express gratitude for the good moments that still existed, there was a clear understanding that this was not something that could be undone by words alone. Because the issues we were facing were not new. They were the result of years of distance, years of unmet expectations, years of trying to make something work that had slowly stopped working. And as that understanding settled in, it brought with it a sense of inevitability that was both overwhelming and strangely clarifying, because it meant that the decision we were facing was not just about the present. In the end, it was never just about leaving. It was about finally choosing truth over comfort and finding strength in letting go of what no longer worked. If this story opened your eyes and made you feel something real, hit subscribe right now for more powerful stories like this, because the next one might change everything you think you know.